All right. Well, good morning to all of you. It is Thursday, January 14th, 2021. So today, kids, I still don't have a Russian Revolution PowerPoint for you, which I apologize for, but I think I deleted the PowerPoint that I have. I cannot find it anywhere. So um, I'm in the process of making a new one, but it's not done yet. So as soon as I get that done, I will post it for you. But unfortunately for today, you're just going to have to watch my ugly mug again, and I'm just going to lecture off of the notes that I have. I have notes that I use for lectures outside of the PowerPoint, and those I can upload, but it's just text, so it probably won't do much for you. But I will have a PowerPoint with pictures and other things like that. It just takes time to make PowerPoints, and normally I have them made, but I just don't know what happened to my Russian Revolution when I have all the other ones. But anyhow, and yes, Venkata, yes, Trump did get impeached for the second time. Unusual political scenario we're all living in right now. I don't know. There is, unlike the first time that he got impeached a couple of years ago, where I gave it a 0% chance that it would that he would be removed from office. This time it seems that there is at least a little bit more chance in the Senate that he would be officially removed. But I mean, at this point, it's only a few days away from Biden's inauguration, so it's definitely politically interesting. This will be stuff that, if I'm still teaching in a million years, which by all indications I will be, this will be stuff that I'll be teaching kids in future years about what happened this year. It was 232 to 197 in the House, yes. And there was some bipartisan support in the House, but now it goes to the Senate, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, well, there's no question that Trump has made history. There's no question about that. So it's interesting. I don't know what to say about it other than it's for me as a history teacher, it's very interesting. All right. So we're talking about the Russian Revolution, and I was telling you last class, just to kind of bring you back up to speed. We talked last class about how there was the last Tsar of Russia was a guy by the name of Nicholas II. All right, Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, and he was part of a dynasty that had been in power in Russia for about 300 years, and that was the Romanov dynasty, or the Romanov dynasty. Well, Jacob, just to answer your question really quickly, let's impeach him 3 days before he leaves office. What's the point? I think they would tell you, so here's why it's politically very interesting. Trump is not a typical Republican. He ran on the Republican ticket, but Trump's policies are not always in line with the Republican platform. And I suspect the reason that the Republicans in both the House and the Senate are at a point where they're willing to do this, it has everything to do with the party and very little to do with Trump himself. I think that at this point the Republican Party is trying to distance themselves from Trump, because they see him as a liability to the future of the Republican Party. That would be my guess. So it's all being done in the name of politics. I don't think it's being done for for ethical purposes or what have you. I really think that Mitch Mcconnell and the other Republicans in the Senate are trying to distance themselves from the Trump era, because it's just gotten out of line and out of control and crazy. So I think that they're trying to set themselves up for the future. Certainly there are a number of people across the country that are still hugely in favor of Trump, but I think that going forward, the Republicans will be looking to shift some of their energies towards finding candidates that are a little bit more in line with the future of the party. That's my guess, at least, to answer your question. Anyhow, we were talking about Nicholas II, and he was the last Tsar of Russia. Why is he the last Tsar? Because he is forced to abdicate, meaning step down from the throne during the midst of the Russian Revolution, which starts in 1917. Now, we were only just kind of scraping the surface of the early years of Nicholas II's reign in Russia. And I told you some things about Nicholas II. He was very much kind of a control freak sort of a guy. He had many, many, many opportunities to make changes, make reforms to the system, and consistently refused to make any changes, to make any reforms to how he rules, which is, he rules the same way that a king from the 1700s would rule, which worked great in the 1700s. But now that it's in the 1900s, Russia is undergoing early industrialization. Times have changed across Europe. There are still a number of, dynasties in power at the start of World War I. Our last unit, when we finished up last semester, was World War I. And one of the things that's the most significant outcomes of the First World War is the First World War saw the end of 4 major dynasties that had been in power for hundreds of years. Those dynasties were the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire came to an end. The Habsburg dynasty in Austria came to an end, also known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The German Empire came to an end. That was the Hohenzollern dynasty, and then the Russian Empire came to an end, and that was the Romanov dynasty under Nicholas II. So those 4 dynasties, 4 long-lasting absolute monarchies, came to an end at the end of World War I. And what I find to be, I was just thinking about this the other day, what I find to be very interesting about this, when you really think about it, right? World War I ended just barely over 100 years ago. It ended in 1918, okay? So 103 years ago, we'll say, not even, okay? Because it ended in November of 1918. And, what is interesting about this is when you think about 100 years, right? People live to be 100 years old. There are plenty of people walking around on the planet right now who are 100 years old. All right, they have been around for 100 years. That's one person's lifetime. And in one person's lifetime, we have gone historically, right? In 100 years, we've gone from a time where we were barely just beginning to figure out flight. We've gone from a time where we were just, where women didn't have the right to vote, okay? We've gone from a time where there were absolute monarchies in power in Europe, you know, that had been in power for hundreds of years. And all of that ended just barely 100 years ago. Just barely 100 years ago. Which goes to show you just how fast human history is accelerating, right? In my lifetime, we are very much, folks, right now living in a renaissance of sorts. No one maybe recognizes the renaissance that we are living through. Or maybe not Renaissance, but at least revolutionary times. And I'm not just referencing Trump by that at all, actually. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about, think about the internet. Think about how different people's lives are today in 2020, even from where they were 40 years ago, in 2021 to back to 1981. Now, 1981, I wasn't even born yet in 1981. I'm 37 years old. I wasn't born until 83. But even since I was born, there have been just tremendous changes to society in a very, very short period of time, relatively speaking, from a historical perspective. And the reason I mention this to you kids is because when you're young, and I remember being young, the world kind of, when you're young and you're building an understanding about the world, you don't have the perspective of the times that happened prior to your birth. Now, most of you in this class are about 15, 16 years old, which means that you weren't born until I was already in college. And I haven't seen it, I've read it. I've read the book 1984, but I haven't seen the movie. So anyhow, you guys, I can tell you're very interested in the Trump news, but I do want to kind of try to stick to what we need to talk about today. Don't get me wrong, I love talking about that stuff, but there are certain things that I have to cover. But to just kind of finish up what I was saying here, you know, we are in unprecedented times. We're really in what I would describe in human history as uncharted waters. Okay, uncharted waters. There's very little by way of reference in history that we can use to really make a whole lot of sense about a lot of the ways in which the world operates today, using the internet and global communication and the level of corporatism and the interconnectedness of the global economy. We have never lived in a time like this in history before, not to this extent. And what I think 2020 has demonstrated about the United States and just in general is how easy it has become for us in the last century, in the last 100 years, going back to the time when Nicholas II was forced to abdicate from this Russian Revolution. We've gotten very inoculated. I think that 2020 pointed out in many ways a lot of systemic weaknesses in the world and in the United States. You know, we in the last year have gone through a pandemic, the likes of which we have not seen for a full century since the Spanish flu broke out during the middle of 1915, 1916, somewhere in that area. And then two, in the United States, we've seen one of the most radical presidencies that we've seen in a long time. We've seen political polarization to a degree that we have not seen in a very long time. And there has been all of the, movements surrounding Black Lives Matter and systemic racism in the United States. Even in terms of the content that we teach in history, it's focusing now on parts of history that have been glossed over, including the contributions of African Americans, but also others. There's a lot more emphasis on talking about parts of history that frankly haven't been talked about a whole lot. Arnav, you're not entirely wrong about that. I got to give you credit where it's due, because both parties are complicit in the same system. The other side of that, though, is that, the system works if you give it a chance to work. The system works if you give it a chance to work. Part of the reason that I think that the Trump presidency has been so rattling to people is because I'm not entirely sure that people really want instability. People want stability. And, I personally don't want to see the United States go to some kind of civil war. I don't want to see the Capitol building raided. I don't want to see violent protesters trying to overthrow the government. I don't want to see states seceding from the nation. I think that if you're looking at stability, stability of the system, no one benefits from war. I just feel like the entire last year has gotten to a tipping point where people really started to feel on a visceral level, this level of instability. I think the reason that Biden was elected had less to do with Biden and more to do with exactly what I'm talking about, which is that I think that people voted for Biden because they were voting for a return to normalcy. I don't think that the system is rigged. I just think that when people went out to vote, I don't think that anyone was like, boy, I'm super passionate about Biden being president. I just think that people were getting sick of the political situation being such a circus all the time. That's at least my take on it. That's the most sense that I can make out of it. Now, of course, there's a lot of people who voted for Trump, and whether they did that for party reasons or whether they did that because they really, believe in Trump's policies or whatever, is kind of neither here nor there, because at the end of the day, it's just been pretty crazy recently. Easy here, guys. I mean, I appreciate you guys' having a having a conversation about this, but let's not get too off kilter here. But all right. So, kids, I am going to put our conversation about this to rest, and I am now going to divert my conversation to the Russian Revolution. So let's pick it up 100 years ago in history. So I talked to you guys about this this kind of Gareth, chill, man. Okay, so all right. I talked to you last time about this body called the Duma. All right. The Duma was supposed to be, okay, supposed to be this representative body of, you know, basically a national parliament for Russia. Think of it that way. It was supposed to be a national parliament for Russia. And the Duma had, you know, they did have quote unquote political parties in Russia. But the thing is that these political parties have no real power because they're still living in an absolutist monarchy under absolutist authoritarian rule by Nicholas II. So because Nicholas II held supreme veto over the Duma, I told you last class, he dissolved the Duma twice and then rebuilt the Duma to have a whole bunch of people, royalists who were loyal to the king or loyal to the Tsar, and so the entire Duma became this extremely conservative body of people who were always going to be on the Tsar's side. And because of that, the Duma ends up being this kind of puppet parliament that really isn't going to do anything to help out the Russian people. One of the major developments that happens in the early 1900s, in the 1903 all the way up through World War I, is there was this political party in Russia called the Social Democrats, who split into two factions, and I told you about them last class just to remind you. The two factions were the Bolsheviks, B-O-L-S, well here I'll just copy and paste it into the chat here. But the Bolsheviks, where did it go? The Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Okay, and so the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And the Bolsheviks were the majority of this Social Democrat Party, okay, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are going to be the most far left radical communists in Russia, okay? The Bolsheviks are going to be following the ideas and the leadership of that guy we talked about last class, Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was a political philosopher who very much subscribed to the ideas of an earlier political philosopher, a German political philosopher by the name of Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in the year 1848. Now, I wanted to take a little bit more time to talk to you about this idea of communism and socialism, because these are words that get thrown around a lot. A lot of times people don't have quite the level of understanding about these terms that they think that they do. And so the terms sometimes get used interchangeably with one another. Socialism and communism, people say, you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's the same thing. Not exactly. It's not exactly the same thing. It is true that that there are similarities between socialism and communism, because at the root of it, what we're talking about is government interference in the economy. Okay, government interference in the economy. As Americans, we have a tendency to be very reluctant to give the government too much ability to interfere in the economy. There's a lot of hesitance. There's a lot of hesitance about, for example, in the United States, people don't want to see their tax dollars pay for social programs, like, for example, healthcare. Okay. Idea being that if you just let people buy their own insurance policies and choose their own, health care and stuff like that, that's the better route to go. In a lot of other nations, by contrast, say Britain or Canada or virtually anywhere in Europe, really, they have what are known as national health care systems, okay? And what happens is if you're a poor person and you get sick, you can go and get treated at a hospital, and it is paid for by the government, okay? This is what we would refer to as a socialist policy, okay? This is socialism in a sense. Now, here in the United States, if we're being completely honest, there are certain things that are socialized here in the United States. Okay, we do have certain elements of socialist, if you will, policies here. For example, the education that you are getting right now. Okay, you are not paying out of pocket to go to school at Eleanor Roosevelt High School. You pay taxes to your parents pay taxes to fund the school system, and that means that you're able to attend school, and it is a public service to you. Your education is a public service. All right. There are other ways in which we subsidize government public services. The post office, okay, is another example. The post office is funded through tax dollars, all right? Also, we have a number of other services, police and fire, and things like that. So you guys are very active in the chat this morning. Holy smokes. Jacob, you're right. Here's the thing. There's no perfect system. Okay, there's no perfect system. You're not wrong that in places where there are socialized healthcare systems, that at times people do have to wait to get services. That's one of the downsides of a socialized healthcare system, is that you end up having wait times for things that are not immediately in emergency to take care of. Here in the United States, you can go and get healthcare services, right? And for example, you could go to the emergency room and they can't turn you away unless you're not sick with anything. But you can go, if you were sick with something and you went to the emergency room, you may have to wait in the emergency room, but you'll get service. Where the problem comes in the American side of the system, of how we do things over here, the problem that we face is that there's a lot of folks who can't afford health insurance, or the health insurance that they do have is not a very good policy. And what ends up happening is people go into the emergency room, they get services, healthcare services, they are billed for those services, and then they can't pay for them. And what that does is it ends up driving up the cost of insurance policies more for people who do buy insurance policies, and that is because then the healthcare system is able to bill the insurance companies for money to pay for the services that other people weren't able to afford. And so it drives up our system as it is right now, sees insurance companies driving up costs for health insurance. And so that the thing that people don't really understand about it is that you're going to pay for it one way or another. And the reason that social health care systems exist is because at some point or another, and I know that this is hard to wrap your head around because you guys are young, but at some point or another, you're going to get old, you're going to have health problems, you're going to get injured, something's going to happen, okay? And you know how it goes. When people get elderly, health problems start to accumulate, and people who are elderly in this country typically haven't been working for a while. They're retired, and they could have been retired for 10, 20 years. And the kinds of services that we have now, we have things for elderly people like Medicare and things like that, which help them, but you pay for that. You know, that comes out of your taxes and stuff like that. And so anyhow, it's a very complicated thing when we talk about that. But the point that I'm really trying to, let's bring it back. The point that I'm really trying to make here is that there's a difference between having isolated pockets of socialized systems, okay? Like education or the postal service or healthcare or whatever it is. These are systems. These are systems that are isolated. In other words, it's not across the board. So here in the United States, we have all sorts of different ways that the government interferes in the economy. Take, for example, like the Food and Drug Administration, right? There are certain standards and things like that that need to be met in order for restaurants to be able to have, you know, certain levels of cleanliness and sanitary conditions and stuff like that. The meat that you buy at the grocery store has to be handled in a certain way. And there is government oversight of those things to make sure that private companies don't create a predatory environment for consumers. So when you go to the grocery store, you want to be able to be sure that the food that you're buying isn't going to make you sick, that it's handled with people who have been washing their hands and these kinds of things. And all of these are laws that in one way or another interfere in the economy, but we accept this interference because you know, it's making the environment for consumers a better place, okay? So anyhow, the difference between socialism and communism, okay? Communism so yeah, guys, I don't even want to touch the ibuprofen conversation, okay? I'm just going to keep moving on here. Communism is when the government takes complete control over everything in the economy. This is very different from socialism. Even though we have aspects in our modern day American society that are socialized, in other words, paid for by tax dollars and used by the public at large, okay? Another example would be like road construction and stuff like that. the government pays private companies to go and build roads, expand freeways, widen the 91, for example, and stuff like that. Okay, the difference between that and communism is that in communism, the entire country, the entire government, okay, runs the entire economy. Okay, there is no private sector anymore in a communist government. In a communist government, everybody is essentially an employee of the state. Think of it that way. So here in the United States, you can go and work at a private company. Okay, you can go and work at any number of different private companies, restaurants, grocery stores, clothing stores, private companies like Amazon or Facebook or Google or whatever else. All of these are private companies, okay? They're private companies that make money for themselves, for the company, to pay their employers, okay? And for various other things. In Russia, when Russia turns communist after their revolution, there are no private companies, okay? And that's the difference between socialism and communism, okay? Socialism is more isolated programs that the government has. For example, the National Parks Service, okay? National parks, state parks, all of those are paid for, maintained by government tax dollars, okay? Socialized, if you will. In Russia, everything is run by the government. So there are no private companies. There are no private services. Everybody is an employee of the state. If you want to buy something, so to give you an example, let's take the grocery store example, okay? The grocery store example. When you go to your local grocery store, Ralph's up in Eastvale there, okay? You go up to Ralph's. When you go to Ralph's and let's say you wanted to go and buy some canned pineapples, okay? Canned pineapples at Ralph's. When you go to the canned fruit section at Ralph's, you can find all sorts of different brands of canned fruits that you can buy. You can buy the Del Monte canned pineapples. You can buy the Dole canned pineapples. You can buy the Ralph's knockoff generic canned pineapples. Okay, and all of these different canned pineapples have different labels on them. Fancy, colorful labels to catch your eye. Okay, there's advertising, there's marketing that goes into getting people to buy certain products, because these companies are private companies that are competing with one another for your business, okay? On the other hand, you have Russia. Let's say that you were going to go and buy canned pineapples in Soviet Union Russia. Okay, number one, you wouldn't be able to find them. They wouldn't have canned pineapples because canned pineapples aren't made. You can't get pineapples in Russia. They don't grow there. Okay, they would have had to trade for those canned pineapples from some other place. So you're not going to be able to find them. But let's just say that they had them. Instead of it being a situation where you go to your local Ralph's, again, a private company, a private grocery store company, you would go to your government requisition store, okay? All right? Yeah, so that you'll buy them, Venkata, okay? Yes, all right? So, but in Russia, there would be no fancy labels, there would be no colorful packaging or anything like that. You'd have one option for the canned pineapples that you're going to buy. It would be the government canned pineapples. It would be a white label with black lettering that says in crazy Russian lettering, canned pineapples. Okay? And that's it. That's your only choice. And by the way, let's say that there was, for whatever reason, a huge demand for canned pineapples. There was, let's say, a giant canned pineapples craze strikes, and everybody's going out and buying canned pineapples because it's the coolest thing that you can do. That wouldn't happen, but let's just say it did. Here in the United States, if private companies recognized that there was a huge demand for canned pineapples, what would they do? They'd start producing more of them to meet that demand. Okay? They'd start producing more of them. In Russia, they wouldn't. There would be a set number of cans of pineapples that they would make every month or whatever, and that's it. And when those canned pineapples run out, they're gone. Okay? And then what happens, because the entire economy is run by the state, this actually, to be honest with you, this happened, not with canned pineapples, but with a different product, rubber. Particularly anything having to do with like automotive rubber. Windshield wipers would be a good example. Now in Russia, the weather is really bad. Okay, the weather's really bad in Russia. And because the weather is bad, that makes the driving conditions really miserable, and you need windshield wipers to wipe the gunk and grime from the terrible weather, dirt, snow, you name it, off of your windshield. But the government of Russia was always extremely low on rubber. Okay, they were very low on rubber. And what would happen is people needed windshield wipers, and so they would go to their government requisition store, they would line up, okay, stand in a giant line as soon as the shipment of windshield wipers arrived at the government store. And then the first, 10 people in line buy windshield wipers, and then there's no windshield wipers left. And you're only allowed to, let's say, buy one. Okay, if you went to a store and you wanted to buy every canned pineapple that they had in there, you could do that, all right? But in Russia, you couldn't do that. So then what people would do, kind of similar to what they do here, like with PS5. You know, PS5 was really hard to get your hands on before the holidays. What people would do is they'd go and they'd buy a PlayStation 5, and then they'd turn around and sell it for twice as much on eBay or something. Here in the United States, that's perfectly legal. You know, you're allowed to sell anything that you want. People will buy it for whatever price that they want. We live in a free economy. You're allowed to do that. You want to go on Craigslist and buy a bike? Go ahead and do it. You want to sell your, old speakers on Craigslist? Go ahead and do it. All right? Things are only worth as much as what someone will buy for it, okay? Or will pay for it, rather. But in Russia, that was illegal, but it didn't stop people from doing it. So what people would do is they'd go and they'd buy these windshield wipers in Soviet Russia, and then they'd sell them on what's called the black market. Okay, the black market. So they knew that they would be able to get a lot more money by reselling those windshield wipers for 2, 3, 4 times as much as they purchased them for to somebody who wanted to buy them. And so you have in Russia, because it's completely communist, what ends up happening is you have a whole lot of people who start to, exchange goods illegally in Russia. Okay, well, the difference being, Arnav, that here it's perfectly legal, but in Russia it was actually illegal to sell stuff secondhand like that. Okay, you weren't supposed to be trading goods on the black market, but it happened all the time. In the 1980s, towards the end of the Soviet Union era, blue jeans became this huge fad in Russia. But Levi's, Levi's is a private American company. How do you get Levi's jeans in Russia. They would buy them illegally. Sometimes Americans would bring jeans over to Russia if they were visiting Russia in the 70s and 80s and sell them to Russian people who were looking to buy them. What's the market in Russia? You'll have to be a little more specific by what you mean by that, Venkata. So anyhow, that kind of gives you that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how different communism is from socialism. Socialism here in the United States tends to be one of those words that immediately makes people uncomfortable, but the reality of the situation is that yeah, I mean, Zoe, there are some parallels to be drawn, certainly. But of course, you know, here in the United States, the one thing that we do all benefit from is living in this kind of capitalistic system where there are private companies and you have a lot of options as a consumer, okay? When you go on Amazon and you want to buy something, there's all sorts of different companies that are competing with one another at different price points, different quality levels, and so on, for you to buy things. If you want to buy a really expensive something or other, you can buy a really expensive something or other. If you want to buy a cheap something other, you can do that. All right. But in Russia, that wasn't the case, because communism is, at the end of the day, totalitarian. Okay, there's no freedom in a communist government, and in a communist government like Russia had, there also tends to be a lot of brutality and terror associated with the government. And when the government has supreme power over everything in the economy, it keeps the people in a really fragile, weak, and fearful position. Okay. So, let's keep talking here about the Russian Revolution. I'm going to bring you forward a little bit. Okay, I'm going to bring you forward a little bit. We've been talking about the Bloody Sunday event. That happened in 1905. Okay, the Bloody Sunday event happened in 1905. And in light of that 1905 insurrection, Bloody Sunday, the Bolsheviks, the radical communist revolutionaries who followed the teachings of Vladimir Lenin, they begin to, they're in exile, okay, they're in exile, but they begin to plan a revolution under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and his good friend Leon Trotsky. And so I told you about how they started developing these Soviets, these workers' councils, okay? And you had a lot of what we call the working class. We have a fancy name for working class when we talk about communist Russia, okay? When we talk about the working class during the communist revolution, I'm going to give you this word here. Proletariat is how you say that word, proletariat, okay? Proletariat is a word to describe the working class, okay? If you will, kind of the lower class. I hate to say lower class because it makes it seem bad, so that's why we usually use the phrase working class. But what do we mean by working class? We're talking about your everyday Joe, okay? Your everyday person. All right, somebody who is working a regular job for a wage, typically not very glamorous work. Another way we refer to it is blue collar work. Blue collar work, things like working in factories, working on farms, working in workshops in urban areas and stuff like that. Okay, the working class. And of course, the working class makes up the majority of the population, pretty much everywhere in the world. Now, here in the United States, of course, a lot of our working class actually hold, relatively good positions. Working class equals slaving away for money for the high class. Yes, Arnav, yes. And what do we call the upper middle class, by the way, Arnav? Do you remember the word that we used to describe upper middle class? Fancy word, French word? Anybody remember? Yes. Bourgeoisie. The working class is the lower class. Yes, that is correct, Venkata. Yes, bourgeoisie. Okay, the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie is the upper middle class, the business owners, people who have what we call white collar positions. Okay, if you've ever heard of white collar crimes, these are usually crimes that are high level crimes like extortion or fraud or things like that. Okay, it's okay. It's okay. You were very, very close. Yeah, I'm proud of you too. Nice job. And so the bourgeoisie. So when we talk about communism, okay, communism, according to Marx, would happen when class warfare took place between the proletariat, who became conscious or aware of their oppression, versus the bourgeoisie. Okay? This is what, and I just put that in there for you so that you'd be able to see it. Communism, according to Marx, would happen when class warfare took place between the proletariat, who became conscious or aware of their oppression, versus the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class people. Okay, wealthy business owners, people at the top of society. Okay, this is the prediction that Marx made. All right, this is the prediction that Marx made. Now, he made this prediction, all right, this was in the Communist Manifesto. Okay, this was all written in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Okay, so he made this prediction in 1848, which is a long time ago. Even a long time ago by the time that the Russian Revolution was happening. It happened 70 years earlier. His prediction, Marx's prediction, has never really come true. Okay, Marx was not correct about how communism would come about. And Vladimir Lenin, the way that he gets the communist revolution off the ground in Russia is he actually breaks away from the way that Marx said that it would happen. And the way that he did this, I talked to you a little bit about it last class, the way that Vladimir Lenin's communist revolution was different from how Marx said that it would happen is that Vladimir Lenin used the political party as a platform to organize the revolution. And so, whereas Marx said that when a communist revolution would take place, essentially all classes and all political parties would just evaporate. There would be no political parties. That is not how it happened, though. When Vladimir Lenin runs his communist revolution in Russia, he uses a political party platform in order to be able to organize and control the people in a much more effective way. And one of the ways that he goes about doing this is by using those Soviets, those workers' councils, particularly the Soviet that was located in St. Petersburg, which was at the time the capital of Russia. Did kids work during that time period to save families? And the answer, Venkata, is absolutely, yeah. Yeah, in the West, in places like America, Britain, France, by the time that we got to about the mid-1800s, many of those places had passed laws against child labor by the mid-1800s. But in Russia, it was very commonplace for children to be working because Russia, being that they were about 100 years behind the rest of Europe in the start of the 20th century, the 1900s, because they were 100 years behind, most people in Russia were still agricultural workers. We had not seen industrialization take off in Russia yet to the degree that industrialization had taken off in France, Britain, and other places. But after this communist revolution takes place in Russia, one of the #1 priorities of the Communist Party after they take over the government is to rapidly industrialize Russia. And so in the 1920s and 1930s, the communists put into place some programs that they hope are going to be able to rapidly allow Russia to catch up with the United States, Germany, Britain, France, in terms of industrialization. And they are not entirely successful in doing that. They're quasi-successful in doing that, but we'll talk about the great cost that that came along with their rapid industrialization programs. But I just need to take a minute here and just ask a quick checking for understanding question. Do you guys understand the difference between socialism and communism? Because it's very important to understand. There's a lot of what we call social democracies around the world where they have a democratically elected government, but there are still socialized systems of the government that pay for certain public services like healthcare, like education, police, fire, postal service, etc. And then there's communism, which is where the government has complete control over everything and there is no private industry anymore, and there's also no democracy because there's only one party, the Communist Party, and the Communist Party is in charge of everything. There's no competition, there's nobody, you can't vote for anyone else. You show up, the only vote that you would have is, do you want the communist leader or the communist leader? I guess I'll select the communist leader. Okay, there are no other political parties in Russia after the communist revolution takes place. Do you guys understand that difference? Right, well, you're right, Arnav, it is no freedom. Because remember that with communism, the goal, I'll write this in here, the goal of communism was to create a utopian, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, but utopian society where everyone was equal, okay? That was the goal of communism, was to create, or put differently, the goal of communism was to create a classless society, okay? Everybody is equal, everybody shares according to their need, and everybody is of the same class. Now, here's the thing about that, okay? Here's the fundamental problem with communism, okay? People are not equal. People are not equal. That's the problem, all right? And people are also not perfect. When we talk about that idea of utopianism, is supposed to be a perfect society. All right? But how do you create a perfect society out of imperfect people? All right? And you're absolutely right, Arnav. So here's the thing. How do you create a society of a perfect society out of imperfect people? The only way that the communists know how to try to create a perfect society out of imperfect people is by using fear, terror, and oppression to control everything. Okay, so communism and this is the point that I'm trying to make, which is actually to Arnav's point that he's making. Okay, the point that he's trying to make here is that as you try to force everyone to be perfectly equal, you inherently must take away their liberty. Okay? All right? All right? So that is, however, I will warn you, the inverse of that statement is also true. The freer you make a society, it will inevitably lead to more inequality. All right? Freedom and equality are inversely related. The more freedom you have, okay, the less equal you become across the board in society. The more equal people are forced to become, the less freedom you have across society. These two things are inversely related with one another. As one goes up, the other must go down. Okay? And that's why we're always trying, via the government, to find a happy balance between freedom and order. Okay? A happy balance between freedom and order. What happens when people are too free to go out and start doing things like vigilante justice, mob rule? Well, what we see happen is order and chaos, disorder and chaos start to reign free. All right? And so, well, Arnav, I think that there are many situations in history where I could point otherwise, okay? For example, in the Gilded Age, in the early, right around the same time as we're talking about here with Russia, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, in America, we had an extremely free economy, all right? But what this did is it allowed the people who were at the top of that economy to exploit the workers through private corporations. So the exploitation, the danger about a super free economy is that the government is no longer the threat. The private companies themselves become the threat, because the private companies become so powerful and so wealthy that those private companies actually are able to influence the government and keep people working across the country in very oppressed working conditions. And that's why in the early 20th century, we saw a number of reforms, laws made to try to make a safer environment for the people in terms of cracking down on private companies who were using really predatory practices that put a lot of people in a very weak, fragile position in the country. Free will is a God-given right. I mean, hey, I am not disagreeing with you. It's interesting that you said, look at a jungle, there's no government. True. Okay, it's interesting that you referenced a jungle, because actually I would encourage you to look into a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It actually is exactly what I'm talking about right now. It's about the meatpacking industry and the absolute brutal horrors of the meatpacking industry. I mean, broken off razor blades, cut off fingers. I mean, it's horrible. And so anyone trying to govern or control you is violating your free will. Arnav, I don't know if I mean, here's the thing. People want order. That's the part that you're forgetting. People want order. People don't like living in chaos. And when we talk about the kind of freedom that you're talking about, supreme freedom to just do whatever, that creates chaos. And people don't like chaos. And that's just a fundamental fact of humankind. You know, people like predictability. When you take it down to the classroom level. If we were going to class, I don't even have to do a seating chart, because 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, where people sit the first day, they will continue sitting, right? Why? Why do people do that? Because people like order. If you walk into the class and someone's sitting in your chair, all of a sudden your world is thrown into chaos. What do? Somebody's sitting where I'm sitting, okay? But the fact of the matter is that people like having order. People like having predictability. People are very routinous. They like routines. They like patterns. And our brains are biologically pre-programmed to search for patterns. Where there are no patterns to be found, this is an unsettling thing. When we can't explain something through causal analysis, this led to that led to this, we don't like that, because it makes the world seem unpredictable. People like predictability, and that's why governments exist, is because they are meant to maintain a modicum of order to keep life predictable. And I'm sorry that you may not like it, but that's just how it is. Well, the whole point of the government that we have, guys, the ideal government is one that is protecting your individual rights of life, liberty, and property. That's the kind of government that we're supposed to subscribe to here in the United States. We want a government that protects our life, liberty, and property. All right? But, you know, where the government fails, I don't think that means that we need to just automatically resort to civil war, violence, and so on. We have the right to peacefully protest in this country, okay? We don't need to run revolutions. We don't need to overthrow the government. All we need to do is make sure that our voice is heard in a democratic system, and the government has shown throughout history, not only here but in other places too, that the government will make reforms, okay? And maybe they make them too late sometimes. I certainly will give you that, but the government will make reforms if the people demand them. That's the reason we have a democracy, is so that the people's voice can be heard. But going back to the Russian Revolution, the very problem with the Russian Revolution is that they convinced the working class. Listen to me, because I'm about to bring this full circle here. Please just listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The reason the Russian Revolution is so darn important is because the politicians like Vladimir Lenin, okay, were able to convince a huge number of people in Russia who were angry about their situation. They were angry about their lives. They were angry about their living conditions and their working conditions. They had very low quality of life. These politicians were able to convince this group of people that if they rose up and overthrew the government, that their problems would be solved. That because they had a strong man in power who cared about the little guy, that all of a sudden their problems would be solved. Okay? And what happened? Vladimir Lenin was able to successfully convince these people to rise up, overthrow the government, and what does he do? The minute that his revolution is successful, he strips every single last right away from these people in the name of increasing his own power. And that is why revolutions are inherently dangerous, okay? That is why, you know, it's why we can all be thankful that that Capitol riot was a failure, okay? You know, we don't need strong men convincing, lying to the people in order to increase their own power. And then all of a sudden, when they finally get it, and they overthrow the system, rip the rug out from underneath people's feet, the same way that Vladimir Lenin did, the same way that Mao Zedong did, the same way that Adolf Hitler did, the same way that Benito Mussolini did, and any other totalitarian dictator in history, Fidel Castro, all the way down the line. Every single one has one goal: increasing their own power. That's it for me today. Have a great day.